have difficulties communicating with one another. Because I think precisely by saying there's something like market failure, that's what you just described. That's the centering of the market for everything. It's we deal with market failure because we realize that there can't be an ideal market, but we're discussing this only as a question of market failure, not from a different type of perspective. But the real comment also I wanted to make was relating to the earlier discussion that we had, which is what travels. How do things actually become so important, and frame our minds and our ideas in policy circles as well? I think one thing that that we all know who are teaching law, especially in U.S. law schools, how these economic ideas travel, because they're in the textbook and uncriticized, right? So when I teach corporations and whatever textbook I use, they say, well, of course, Pareto efficiency can't be achieved, but we do Calvert-Hicks. We just do basically a balance of costs and benefits, and if the net balance is better, then that's enough. And that's how it's transmitted to a next generation that is having taught economics, is how to disentangle these models. But it's interesting for me also that these models have this kind of tractability, and I think precisely when they are, when a real economist would say they're false, or they're actually not, they're just using them as like as a tool, but precisely because they have this simplicity, this utilitarian character to them, that they become so powerful in the public imagination, in the use of them commercially. What I find puzzling myself is that usually we think that people think about fixed stories, like life stories, people that we bring, that they travel. But I think in the discourse about big policy issues, economics in particular, these modern ideas, this transaction cost, everybody knows what it is. It goes through, everybody knows what it is. Right? Whether they have really thought about this, are able to disentangle is a different question, but I think that has had much greater impact on the public discourse than maybe the field around the
Let me just add one thing to that, because this came up last time when I was pushing more on how models become performative. And I would mention that, again, it was Orr's original form. So I fully with you, and I'm like, the textbooks say it, and then someone who's sophisticated will come along and say, yeah, but this is the textbook, and I can tell you that we work with the models in the high theory, it's this more sophisticated. So one, I don't think we're only tracking, but one thing I think we're tracking is the way that high theoretic concepts get transmitted and received by people who don't have more sophistication about them. I don't know if there's I don't know what that looks like, but there's some kind of uptake of a model in a simple way that then becomes ideological in the crude way that I was defining, not in the more sophisticated way. And all of my economist friends complain about this bitterly. They feel that lots is ascribed to them almost as a moral failing. They're like, I'm not guilty of that. And I accept they're not guilty of that. And yet, I'm curious about how the transmission line works. And why is it that something, and the economists say, people are not, nothing in the model says people are selfish, right? Take a really simple one. Nothing in the model says people are selfish. There's, and then economists say people are selfish. Well, how is it that the high theory doesn't get heard, or what gets heard? So I don't know what to say about that, but I think that is one aspect that we're tracking about how models become performative. It's not via the sophisticated model builder. Do you have thoughts on this? You must see it with your students, for example, right?
Yeah, so I feel it's my kind of job to be a corrective to that.
Good.
When I started my first when I teach law and economics, I look, there's all these misconceptions about law and economics, and I'll tell you why they're wrong. But I wanted to actually do something else. So I think, so when I'm hearing this, it strikes me as absolutely right if you're thinking about the old Chicago school view of, say, law and economics. You have the market, regulation is bad, the market will, it's like an Adam Smith on steroids when kind of the old school of Chicago. But my sense is that even when we're talking about that transmission and popularization beyond, a small group of experts, nobody thinks of law and economics in the Chicago terms anymore. Okay, so there is, it is no longer by any means a dominant school within law and economics, and so I think it even, sometimes it's talked about the Cambridge School of understanding that the market is, deeply flawed, and thinking about another institution. So you're saying going back to, to the old political economy. I think people really are thinking about, regulation and law as an institution, and the market and the other, and fighting about what is the right, borderline between them. So my sense is this is not like an elitist modeling kind of thing. That's my sense of how these are actually kind of transmitted. but you know, maybe I'm.
I had
maybe I'm
Alan
alone,
Schwartz for
I-
contract, so what can I say? We all know Alan.
That would do it.
I had Alan Schwartz for contract.
So maybe two comments, and sometimes they go kind of opposing one another. So there are 2 points in the paper when you talk about the logic of the market and complain about its expansion, but then you assume a certain contingent understanding of the market, which strike me as kind of paradoxical, in which you kind of succumb to a specific and historically specific understanding, and definitely conceptually specific understanding of what the market is or can be, which, if it is indeed the essential understanding, go back to essentialism, understanding of the market, justifies resistance. But there's something paradoxical of someone who's trying to de-essentialize a certain understanding of that realm of society to resist it, and you acknowledge obviously about how the market is legally constructed, and that kind of even strengthen this point. So kind of those points in which you talk about the logic in the market and resist, I think you need to kind of pay attention, or I mean,
Yeah.
what do you exactly want to say? I mean,
Right.
isn't it maybe what you want to do is something very different? Maybe you want to go with the expansion of the market, but with a different understanding of what the market is, right? So it's in order to know whether you're fighting against that, we need to know what is that.
Mhm.
So that's the first comment. The second comment is that this actually relates to I think to your main point, and to some extent to something that I think you can respond to. I will try to respond on your behalf. Which is right. You say that one important point that you say, I think, is that talking about externalities and transaction costs, and let's leave aside wealth maximization, is meaningless, unintelligible, without making deep value judgments, which means that Pareto is empty, right? But now, so I want to do 2 more things. One is to connect it to my prior point, right? And you can see the connection, right?
Yeah.
That requires for you to disavow the certain understanding, the contingent understanding of the market that you're succumbing and kind of stalking into there. But it also helps you, I think, resist some of Oren's point regarding, like when Oren says that there is a Pareto when we do contract, and then afterwards Oren acknowledges that we come with our endowment, and they construct our bargaining power, and your comeback, I think, is hey, some of those endowments are legally constructed, and you economists are trying to tell us what are the rules of the game should be, but that is total tautology, right? Because we cannot know what the rules of we cannot use the tools regarding the rules of the game by kind of assuming that there are rules of the game, right? So we need to make value judgments that are prior to that.
But one of the standard understanding is that the law maybe is the primary institution because it sets the entitlements.
Yeah.
It specifies
Yeah,
them,
but
and then you can bargain, you know,
Yeah, right.
and the law can be a player.
Right. But when you write about disclosure or duress or whatever, and using economic tools, right? The rules regarding duress and disclosure and whatever will determine, not fully determine, will impact our bargaining power. So the kind of endogeneity that I think is part of David's point is there, and I'm not sure that even in sophisticated economic analysis, it is at least not fully acknowledged. We can be, okay.
So the thought of setting an entitlement, initial entitlement, or a judge mimicking entitlement, where it's most efficient, i.e. for the person who values it the most, you would say that's Chicago and it's not Cambridge.
No, well, so I think both
That would be
agree.
the kind of thing to come
I
up
think
with.
both would agree that, you know, when we're talking about general equilibrium or resting, whatever analysis, there is a beginning, the starting point is a certain distribution of endowments. And you know, if that distribution is bad, then everything else will be bad. And the definition of that initial distribution has nothing to do with the market. These are all
What would make it bad?
if it's unequally distributed between people. So again, there are many other reasons, other normative criteria, but if we think about distributional equity, which I think you mentioned, then if the initial endowments are very unequally distributed, then everybody would say that whatever market, frictionless transaction cost, free transaction cost will lead you to distributionally very unattractive outcomes.
Good.
It's not because of the market, it's because of the way the other institutions allocate the
People want in. Do you want? So briefly on Hanok's first point, this question of the logic of the market and its contingency reminds me of the puzzle that I think you put to Roy about money and the possibility of money being many things over time versus something like it's just its scope. And it strikes me that you can have, this is abstract, but you can have something that has a logic, but nevertheless is contingent in the sense that it's a historical formation that didn't obtain before a point, and perhaps arguably won't obtain later. But that for the duration of something that you can hold relatively constant, you can say there's a logic to that operation. So the question then would be whether or not there's something like modern market or the monetary structure of modern money that means that you have a logic to certain kinds of private law relations that have this market-like structure. Contingent in the sense that one could have designed it otherwise, but given that one didn't, then there's a logic that obtains. So first, to your initial caution, I'll be super careful about how I lay that out. But does that make sense to you? Is there a problem with that? So I don't think I have to assert a transhistorical essence of the market to assert that it has a logic, at least at a certain historical point, for a long enough period of time that it can do certain kinds of work, like expansion.
I'm not sure that it's. I think that we can. If one of the, it depends on the adjective, right? If the first thing that comes to mind is labor market, then you can think about labor market as kind of totally and you can think about sophisticated labor market and have Sweden as your I have two Swedish friends here, as your kind of image. In which case you would have a very different understanding of the kind of the core idea of what the market needs, right? Or when we think non-pejoratively of the term marketplace of ideas, then kind of the expand all of, right? So I'm not sure. Maybe maybe it only requires an adjective when you talk about the expansion of competitive market, right?
Right.
Maybe you just mean maybe it's just a really technical minor point.
Right. No, it's minor because it comes to the thought that on the spectrum between something like competition and cooperation, there's probably some undefinable point where quantitative small shift becomes a qualitative shift. And that would bring with it a different normative logic at that end of the spectrum. But I can't lay that out.
And even there, I think that Oren, and in this case I will be with him, will point out to a significant body of recent economic literature that talks about cooperation and trust as necessary building blocks of sophisticated, cutting-edge market, right? We'll do that.
As long as you're with me, yes.
Thanks. So actually, I'm going to follow up on the trust concept because my name is Yaman. I'm an economist. I'm a PhD candidate here at the economics department, and I'm working about sort of similar issues. I'm doing history of economics, and I think that one thing that comes up here in this discussion, I feel, is the difference between the model of the market, the economic standard, neoclassical standard model of the market, or the general equilibrium model of the market, and markets, which are very different things. And I think that when you speak, if I understood correctly, about the logic of the market, you're speaking about the logic of the model, of the neoclassical model of the market, and the way I think we see at least 50 last years, how this logic become the basic for analyzing other institutions, right? This is like a famous imperialism. But I think that what you're trying to analyze in this paper, which I like very much, is something more subtle than the Chicago type imperialism. And this is how economists who were actually against the view of the self-regulating markets as the real description or good enough description of markets try to use the same logic to criticize this image. And the most dominant economist, I think, in this tradition is Kenneth Arrow, which is not only a very important theoretical economics, he was actually the one who proved the existence of the general equilibrium and the welfare theorems, together with other economists. And Arrow himself, when he received the Nobel for this specific achievement, said, in my own thinking, I'm here quoting, the model of general equilibrium under uncertainty is a normative ideal as an empirical description, and it is the way the actual world differs from the criteria of the model, which suggests social policy to improve the efficiency. So, and I think this is exactly what you're trying to point out, this exact view, and I think that the interesting methodological tension here, or methodological concept, is the normative ideal. What does it mean that this is a normative ideal? And for Arrow, this does not mean that it's something that we want to achieve, because for him, and he explained that we cannot achieve this ideal, but it still acts as our sort of ideal image that we use to analyze what is going on. And if I'm going back to the trust concept, which is actually an Arrowian concept, because Arrow was one of the first economists who explicitly said that trust is very important. He's saying trust is a way of society to compensate for market failures that arise from informational gaps. And I think here we can see exactly what your point, because it's very weird to say that trust is a way to compensate for market failures, because trust is a much older historically phenomenon than those type of markets. But within the world, the model world, within this framework, we can think about trust as a way to compensate for the lack of markets. And I think that those are the things that I also struggle with to explain what is exactly is happening when we're embracing this type of methodological approach to analyze social institutions in general. And I feel I'm somewhere in between thinking that on the one hand it's obviously a very powerful analytical framework, and it helps us to explain why markets are many times not self-regulating, but on the other hand it feels that it still somehow distorts the way we think about institutions, at least in some cases. But I think that it's actually a very important task to understand what's going on there. So I'm very thankful for this work, and
I'm grateful for your comment. That's super helpful, and someone who's actually read Arrow is always a huge plus. I mean, his comment there is echoed by lots of folks in that mid-century, which is the thought being that this abstract model is the best, as I quoted Perelman, is the best rationalization we have of the competitive market system. There he's saying it somewhat sets, if you will, my language as a regulative ideal. So of course we're not in that world, but we sort of aim at it. Now one could say, as we talked about at the break, I think for someone like Arrow that's clear. For someone like Debreu, who came afterward, I think he's just working out the logic of like fixed points and things. I don't think he had any institutional or normative conception really. I think like he was interested in how you can show that there's an equilibrium as a mathematical technique. So, and then from that line, people are like, oh, it's just a model, we play with it, and we do these cool things. And, so I think there's an open question whether or not, again, that comes back to the high theory point. Like, even, to your point, even some high theorists are sort of saying, look, this is an ideal, but we should realize in practice. And then others think it's a technical object that's useful for motivating analysis. And I don't, just like you, I don't know how to make sense of those sorts of models. And coming back to the conversation we had at the beginning with Roy, what leads to sort of uptake? Which models, we get the point that some of these models travel context, like more easily. Some concepts move context more easily. But when we say moves context, what's involved in the process of sort of thinking of the model as normative or regulative? I mean, there's more interest in this sort of performative thing, the reflexivity aspects. I think the money argument is probably one of the best, because there you can show that bankers who are making decisions are relying on models. But like a competitive market economy, it's not like I read Arrow Debreu before I started making decisions under scarcity, right? So so it's a bit of a puzzle that way. But I thank you. I think that's spot on.
Can I just say this? It was such a beautiful Helen Mackenzie. I want to ask about the dissenters review. I didn't catch your name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe a dissenter, right? Somebody sort of on the fence. So one way to ask the question of how we uptake is to ask who are the dissenters along the way and
Good.
say
But we don't
the
get
field,
that.
right? In a way it's saying, can you fill the gap between null and the totalizing market,
Mhm.
right? Where was the debate or how would you, given your erudition on economic, the history of economics, how do you think about debate over this vocabulary? The people who are resisting or are, where's the angst? I guess I'm saying, where's the struggle? What can we learn from that when we're thinking about the discourse itself?
That's a very interesting question. It gets into genealogy of the history of economic thought, which I don't want to presuppose answers in the analytical problems in itself, but maybe suggestive toward people. So then, with apologies, basically, it seems to me that at least two issues are relevant as between kind of classical political economy and its apogee. Kate Mill, Principles of Political Economy, 1848 is like the textbook in those days, and Era de Breu, late 50s, de Breu's theory of value of 59 is a kind of as this sort of new account. The move to marginalism takes place in three different theaters, interestingly, but with apparently little, it's independent uses of it. So obviously in England with Edgeworth, Jevons, Edgeworth, and then Marshall as the great capstone. In France with Walras and Pareto, and then in Austria with Montalbert. And across all of those different sites of marginalism, the puzzle about what the social good is in exchange shifts when you begin to focus on exchange at the margin. And so there's even terminological shifts, which is always useful to think about. So, Irving Fisher in the 1890s saying, look, we can't call this utility what you get in the market. Let's call it something else, wantability. Because utility has this general usefulness, it's inflective of moral, the collective moral thing. Well, let's just talk about wantability. Pareto, of course, famously says ophelimity. So they're making up new words to try and define the by the time of the welfare economics, they just revert back to utility. But even in Marshall, utility had this. So the one thing to trace would be the thinning out of what had been a sort of thick number concept in which down to something that really is satisfaction of preferences for markets. And Pareto's optimality criteria is a crucial benchmark. But you get the key moves made in Edgeworth in this sort of two-person two-book. The second big thing that happens is production drops out of the equation. So value is deeply tied to production in classical political economy. And value is basically derived from consumption in the 20th century. And you can see that again, the Edgeworth box isn't a production. You just have it's Moniford heaven. And they bring, so all of the arguments about production that were based on labor theory of value get swept away in favor of something that's a demand side, not a production or supply side. And one of the key things that has to be done, and de Breu is very specific on this, you have to ignore economies of scale in production processes to get tractable rules. Now I know that further mathematical refinement allows you to have some computational general Fulbright models with economies of scale built in some ways. But in general, from Edgeworth onwards with de Breu, the thought is you can't have scale economies if you're going to make these things work well. And what's interesting is, compared to the 19th century, all of Marx's critique of the way in which capitalism is going to be expansionary and come to dominate is based on what I think we read as a scale. Smith's argument initially about the progress of the market, the progressive quality of wealth, is a scale argument. We can read that back in. The division of labor, why does division of labor is it's a scale argument. So there's a really interesting move in the 1870s, 1880s to just take production out and refocus the whole thing, including its valorization, on demand and consumption. And the full ramifications of that, I don't think we properly contended with. they're obviously, this is one of those cases where I wouldn't call it, it's not necessarily subversive. Like, I don't know exactly whether it was the turn to marginals that drove the shift in the value conversation, or there was an anxiety about the value conversation that was going to drove the shift in method, in technique rather. But they're going together. There's some kind of elective affinity between sidelining questions of productive justice and labor, and the tractability of certain kinds of models.
But generally, they don't have labor in production, right?
They read it back in, but so Edward Box doesn't.
Right, but your focus is the general equilibrium constant. That's in all the different markets.
That's right. But the way that they do it, so this gets somewhere in the weeds, but initially production is seen as driving demand on that side, whereas then production is re-understood as another market for labor based on firms' needs for that. And so they bring production back into the aegis of what the Knight Institute would have thought of as like the consumption choice. And that's why the dependent and independent axes of supply and demand are the reverse in economic models compared to what you would expect in mathematics. It's because they're first analyzed assuming that supply drives demand and vice versa. And it's actually the shift in the discourse that means that the whole, you know, if you think you're partial is the limit. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think those would be the things to think about.
And
Whether
some of
those
the
things.
centers just get knocked out of the field.
Right. So someone like Pirosrov, the 20th arguments Marshall said, you just can't do this kind of stuff without really increasing returns, and you're ignoring production or the industry. He's one of many people who saw it on
Obviously, it's further afield.
Oh yeah, I mean people who are arguing within the,
Yeah.
that's right, internal critics versus external critics who we have defined as outside of logic.
Okay, so we have another 7 or 8 minutes, and so let's take a few comments together. So Marietta, Burak, and Joshin, one of you. So let's take all of those, and then I'll do a minute to Annalisa, and then you'll have 30 seconds to
Good. I'm glad to get more.
to respond.
I'll be very brief. Thank you. It's enormously great paper and this would be great and fun and talk hill. Just a point on what you just said, this fits in nicely.
Can you speak louder, Marietta?
Yes, I
Thank
tried
you.
to speak up. Thank you. So you pointed all through that you pointed out as a problem that these concepts are too abstract or can be too concrete at the same time and you don't know just which is which, and sort of this thinning out of thick concepts, thinner concepts being a problem in that they lead to the totalization of markets. The market. I don't think that's a weakness, that's a strength. And that's precisely the reason why this is so strong. It's because a concept which doesn't carry so much biology, which can be sort of easily detached from a larger theory, that's precisely how economic thinking. Well, we can complain about the power of the economic paradigm in the 20th century, but that's like a general point in the history of science. So I read this with great pleasure, but I was like, well, I don't think this is subversive that market concepts generalizing so much that even its exteriors are sort of taken inside as precisely the point of the concept.
I think I was next. I'll be very brief anyway. So is what terrific stuff, and I mean to some degree, maybe the question that emerges out of your conversation with Chris is why we're still talking about Marshall in economics. And I think the answer, or at least one answer, is that the Coastian revolution has failed. Coase identified that, look, there are a lot of really important transactions that happen inside the firm. And in spite of, the paper begins with all these Nobel Prize winners that are trying to build on top of that observation. But we still, especially in the world of law and economics, only talk about economic activity that are outside the firm. Even when we talk about corporate law, we're talking about the outside the firm. The firms is still, the black box. And maybe that's because, of a failure of imagination, or maybe it's because we're still looking underneath the streetlight. We can identify prices, but we can't identify transaction costs. Maybe it's because, the world of organizational behavior is so marginalized. Williamson would be the first to say this, I think, that there's just an extraordinary amount of important economic activity inside institutions, inside firms, and inside bureaucracies, and we just don't know a lot about it. So to some degree, the fact that we're talking about Marshallian economics is a reflection of how much more we still have to build on top of Coase. And maybe that's maybe Coase and Williamson and North are still the dissenters, even though they've gotten the Nobel Prize.
Yes, thank you. So the paper was great indeed, and I have one very, very crisp comment about it, because I very like the way you consider your critique of the transaction cost theory. However, when I was reading your paper, I started thinking that maybe this is exactly how the transaction cost theory looks like. So maybe we just reached a point in our thinking about it where we should simply acknowledge that it's not the all-embracing theory that can explain us everything. It's a very nice heuristic instrument you can use to theorize about market without some frictions that appear on the market. A very nice heuristic instrument we can use to introduce ourselves to thinking about contracts, for example, in a contract class. But it's not necessarily something we can use in order to build any more robust theoretical models, because both in the Pareto version and in the Adolf Higgs version, it simply does not deliver its promise. It does not deliver any comprehensive explanatory framework. So maybe this is where we should just put the full stop and say, this is how it is about this theory. It will not do anything else.
To comment, I enjoyed this a lot. One is, I was wondering, I mean, you have this a bit, but maybe you need to put a bit more emphasis on the pure choice of methods that you find in economics, and
Pure joy.
of methods, and how methods, maths, yes, joy. If I remember correctly, the three discoverers of marginal utility, they took over some mathematical apparatus from chemistry at the time. And that's why you have these three inventions at the same time. I hope that's correct.
I mean, basically, yeah.
Yes, I say, and you have some other points where it's new mathematical methods that are actually trying to change. And and I think that's just part of the history here. And that leads me to my second question, really. And this is something that I found very interesting in your paper. How is the decision made which epicycles are considered necessary? And sometimes those are entry points with more ideology, sometimes it can be sort of counter-ideological, but in any case, it seems that very often it's sort of ad hoc that some people have some experience and think, oh, this needs to be employed, but they read a bit of sociology. Or there's a big central discussion about, say, climate change, and then the economists also use models. But it seems that there's no systematic method behind this. And and then you really fall back into this question of, is what's scientific about this choice and how it's being made? For example, all the stuff that feminist economists have done to, you could say, find more epicycles, or find more market failures, find more things that need to be added to the models once women were allowed to join economics. So this seems to be another field where a lot of ideological, interesting moves are being made.
So, thank you for a very interesting paper. I'll try to be brief. So I want to also bring up the question of the corporation. So I think the way I and a lot of people, I'm from political theory, and I think in political theory people are just discovering Coase, and what Coase does is produce a kind of distinction between markets and firms as two economic institutions that have this distinction that one is competitive and one is collaborative, for the sake of argument. And I was kind of wondering if these second-order transaction costs that you point to are inviting us to actually identify the distinction itself as an institution or is institutionally governed. The line between firms and markets as itself having this adding a third into this nice distinction.
Gosh, that's a lot. Let me respond briefly. I'll hold you just for a minute if that's okay. Okay. I don't think I need to. So Marietta, on the thinning out of thick concepts being the point, I fully accept that that's the point, right, of the abstraction. The question is whether it works for the relevant normative and other views. And so that's the debate. You say it does. Other people disagree. You can't just assert it does, right? The point is, we can agree that that is the point of the model without that agreement determining whether the other normative, right? So I agree with you. We're in agreement on that. You say it's a feature, not a bug, and I agree. But Barak, it's fascinating. The Cosine revolution has failed. I think you should write that article. I would be super interested in reading it. I mean, that it would evolve, and this picks somewhat up on the last comment, into like the study of business and internal organization is both inevitable. I think it's the right move. But then the problem is like, you don't have prices basically to study, and so I don't know what you're I don't know how whether you can kind of pile on more, or whether you have to sort of shift the frame to different kind of organizational. I'm interested in those shifting the frame, but I think that would be a good example of a point where the model can't follow you into where you want to go, and so then you have to have a theoretical or conceptual innovation. I don't know what William Sewell said about that, but I'm looking forward to your paper tomorrow to hear more. On the thought and related to this, the gentleman, I'm sorry, I didn't actually remember your name at the end after the lightning round.
So my name is Mateusz, it can be also Matthew.
Matthew, okay.
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay. So you say maybe the transaction cost theory has evolved. It's a heuristic instrument and no longer, and I take those two comments as responsive. And then just to throw out other models, because maybe it takes a model to be a model. I'll give you a model, it's called class conflict. It's where people who have differential access to means of production fight over the joint product of their cooperative activity. Right? So, you know, it will cover certain things, and transaction costs will cover certain things, and I'm curious about the overlap and what is inside and outside. But just to note, right, if we were in a room of like good Marxists, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in the firm or this and that, people just go, yeah, it's class conflict, we have a model for that. So that's itself, you know, that's for what it is. So I agree with you, but if transaction cost, you know, where would it evolve to? If it's fighting over the who gets what out of a contract, I mean, Marx has a lot that he said about that. The pure joy method, it's interesting. I wonder how to address that, because I think you're right, Lisa, that that's driving a lot of folks, the sort of the aesthetics of
And the
method.
maintenance of mathematics, if I may say.
Okay, well, yeah, but the beautiful, the interesting thing is that although the math that's used in the marginalist revolution is picked up from a variety of sources, like you know, the French, the École de Chaussée, so it's like railroads, it's optimization theory. It's not that sophisticated, so it's not even 19th century, it's new, basically. And William Whewell, who was the great dawn of math at Cambridge in the 40s and 50s, he actually did an analysis of Ricardo and tried to mathematize it in the 1830s. It's little known. He wrote 3 papers for the Royal Society. Basically, that it can't be mathematized because it doesn't deal with precise quantities. And so, and that episode seems to have been totally forgotten 40 years later when independent discovery said it can be. So that strikes me as thinking that it's not the technique that's doing the work. It's some shift in that intervening 40 years that meant that that form of mathematical modeling suddenly felt appropriate for people who understood, you know, everything that Whewell understood, but Whewell didn't do that. So that's more of a puzzle to why marginalism emerges than that it's the straightforward application of the calculus of differentials and quantities. Why it could be thought that there was such a thing as an economic quantity that could be so differentiated. These are the puzzles. And someone very intelligent in 1830 didn't think it was possible, and lots of people very intelligent in 1870 did think it was possible. So you fill in your social or intellectual history for those before that. That seems important. To your broader point about which epicycles are considered necessary, my guess is this is probably unsatisfying, but then at that point we end up with a sort of thickly contextured sociology of knowledge about who's where, saying what to whom. Because presumably, if we're really talking about epicycles, there could be many different epicycles which work to stabilize the system, and which one of them gets picked up would be sociology of knowledge in the same way that whose technical terms for roughly the same phenomena get picked up, and who gets the citations, and you know, at that point we're talking peer-to-peer rather than better than anybody else. And what's scientific about the choice? I mean, it's a rhetorical question. In this, if you think it's this kind of emerging bubble. On the corporations, I think you spotted something that is very deep, and you could sort of see where I was going with the higher orders analysis. I'm not sure that the distinction between like market and firm, or even like public-private, would be a second order transaction cost, but I cheekily suggest in the paper that you can just keep going up, and as you go up, you end up in an ontosociological domain, which is like and that's where I was thinking. So even an idea like public-private is probably a nth order cost of change that structures subsidiary costs of change all the way down, would be my guess. But I'm not surprised that you have a political theory background, and you saw what I was doing. I also have a political theory background, and this is a relatively transparent attempt to sort of bring the very fact that concepts perform work, that models become real. How do we account for that within a model? I would think of that as an nth order transaction cost. The way we think about ordering is affecting things, which then affect how costly transactions are in any given. Yes. Thank you.
On that happy note.